A Japanese sentry stands on a platform 12 feet above a prison camp on the island of Luzon. His whole reason for existing is to see. The ground in front of him has been cleared for exactly that purpose. Every blade of tall grass that could hide a man has been cut back, so that anyone approaching the wire must cross open earth in plain view. He has a rifle, a good field of fire, and 2 more towers like his own watching the same ground. A few hundred yards out, a Filipino farmer is bent over in a flooded rice paddy, working the seedlings the way farmers have worked them on that plain for 1,000 years. The sentry has seen this farmer before. He does not give him a second look. And that is the single most important fact in this entire story. Because the farmer is not a farmer. He is counting. He is counting the towers, and the guards in them, and the sentry at the gate, and the pillbox by the fence, and the exact number of rifles inside the wire. He is memorizing which building holds the tanks. The man whose job is to see is looking directly at the man who is seeing everything, and he notices nothing at all. For roughly 3 years, across 1,000 islands, this happened to the Imperial Japanese Army again and again, and its officers could never fully explain it. Their garrisons were struck by raids that seemed to arrive already knowing everything. The attackers knew where the guard posts were before the first shot. They knew the strength of the garrison, the layout of the wire, the rotation of the sentries, sometimes the precise minute when the guards would be at their weakest. Camps that had sat undisturbed for months were emptied in less than half an hour by men who moved as if they had lived there. And the Japanese commanders, trying to understand how, reached for the only explanations their experience contained. They decided there were spies among the prisoners. They decided there were traitors in the villages. They tortured suspects and shot informers and tightened their checkpoints, and none of it changed anything, because they were hunting for the wrong kind of enemy. They were looking for a thing, a person to catch, a document to seize, a leak to plug. The truth was not a thing. The truth had no headquarters to raid and no single traitor to execute. It wore a straw hat and worked a rice paddy. It rode inside a fishing boat and a smuggled radio the size of a suitcase. It lived in the memory of a schoolteacher, a bus driver, a priest, a market woman, and 100,000 others who had quietly decided, years earlier, which side they were on. In its purest form it was not even visible, because loyalty is not visible. You cannot photograph it from the air. You cannot break it with a code machine. You cannot arrest a whole people. Tonight we run the forensic audit on one of the quietest mysteries of the war in the Pacific. Why the soldiers of an army that had conquered half of Asia could never explain how ordinary American scouts seemed to read their minds, to know exactly where their sentries stood, and exactly when to strike them down. The answer is not a secret weapon. It is stranger than a secret weapon. And to find it, we have to go back to the middle of 1943, to a muddy jungle island most people have never heard of, and to a general who had learned the hard way that an army which cannot see is an army waiting to lose. The problem he faced was as old as war itself, and almost nobody had solved it. An army fighting across an ocean is very nearly blind. Lieutenant General Walter Krueger commanded the newly formed 6th United States Army in the Southwest Pacific, and his area of responsibility was made more of water than of land. Somewhere out there, on islands he had never walked, the Japanese were digging in. He needed to know where. Not roughly where. Exactly where. How many men? What kind of units? On which beach? Behind which ridge? Because in an amphibious landing, a wrong guess is measured in drowned battalions. The tools he was handed were powerful and, on their own, not enough. High above the islands, aircraft could take photographs. Far to the rear, cryptographers were quietly breaking Japanese codes, an achievement so secret that most of the men who benefited from it never knew it existed. This was a kind of genius. It could tell you that a convoy had sailed or that a division had been ordered to an island. But a photograph taken from 3 miles up cannot tell you how deep a bunker is, or whether the guns in it are real or wooden decoys. A decoded message cannot tell you the daily routine of the sentries at a prison camp, or which building holds the tanks, or the exact moment each morning when the guards set their rifles down. Krueger had a fast brain and high eyes, and he was still missing the one thing that wins or loses a landing. He had no eyes on the ground. He had been burned before by intelligence that came from too far away and turned out to be wrong, and he had decided he would never trust his men's lives to a guess again. So he did something his own superiors found faintly unnecessary. He decided the army should grow its own eyes. Not aircraft, not code machines, but small teams of hand-picked men who would go in on foot, behind the enemy, look at the thing with their own eyes, and come back alive to report it. On November 28, 1943, on Ferguson Island off the coast of New Guinea, he ordered the creation of a training centre for exactly this. He was careful about what he called it. He named it a training centre, and not a combat unit, on purpose, because troop training was an army commander's own business, and by keeping the name modest, he kept the idea out of reach of higher headquarters that might have taken it away from him or handed it to somebody else. He gave the men a name that came from his own life. Krueger had a long association with the city of San Antonio, in Texas, and its old mission, the Alamo, and his task force already carried the nickname Alamo Force. His scouts became the Alamo Scouts. The strangest thing about them was the doctrine. These were not commandos, though people constantly mistook them for commandos. They were not raiders, though they could raid. Their entire purpose was the opposite of a soldier's ordinary instinct. They were trained, above all, to avoid a fight. A gunfight meant they had been seen, and being seen meant the picture they carried might never get home. The weapon was not the rifle. The weapon was the picture in the scout's head, and everything about his training was built to protect it. Of more than 700 hand-picked volunteers who came through the school, fewer than 140 were kept. Those who made it were formed into teams of 6 or 7 men who learned to move through jungle without a sound, to handle a rubber boat in surf at night, to count and remember and draw, and above all, to come and go like ghosts. The training was deliberately merciless because the job left no room for error. A scout learned to swim ashore through night surf with his weapon and his radio kept dry. He learned to live for days on what he could carry, to navigate by the stars and by memory across country that had no signposts and no friendly line to fall back on. He learned to lie still and watch a position for hours, and come away with the number of every gun and the timing of every patrol. And he learned the hardest discipline of all, which was to walk away from a fight he could easily win, because a dead enemy was a sounded alarm, and a sounded alarm was a mission failed. To the rest of the army, an army built around the idea of closing with the enemy and destroying him, this was a strange and almost backwards way to make a soldier. The strangeness was the whole point. Krueger was not building fighters. He was building a set of eyes that could go anywhere and always come home. What they achieved with that training is almost hard to believe, and it is documented. Over the life of the unit, the Alamo Scouts ran more than 100 missions deep behind Japanese lines, and across all of them they never lost a single man to death or capture on an operation. Read that again, because it is the finest report card a reconnaissance unit has ever earned. In New Guinea they proved the idea over and over. In one operation on the coast of Dutch New Guinea, at a place called Cape Oransbury, teams led by Nellist and Roundsaville struck a cluster of enemy positions in the dark, wiped out the guard force, and carried off dozens of Dutch and Javanese civilians the Japanese had been holding. And again they lost not a single man. Across the New Guinea campaign, the Scouts liberated close to 200 Allied prisoners without a garrison ever mounting an effective pursuit. They snatched Japanese soldiers out of their own lines and carried them back for interrogation. Krueger trusted them so completely that he used them as his personal bodyguard when he went forward, and the order he gave those men reveals how high the stakes ran. If his capture ever became certain, they were to shoot him, rather than let the Japanese take him alive and torture out of him the one secret he was not allowed to lose, that the Allies were reading the enemy's mail. That is how much an army will pay for men it can trust to be invisible. And here is the part that separates this story from every tale of gadgets and machines. The Alamo Scouts' most important equipment was not issued by the army at all. It was a borrowed shirt, a woven hat, and a patience that could hold a man motionless in a paddy for a day. The weapon was a pencil and a good memory. When the moment came, the greatest reconnaissance instrument of the Pacific War was a young man in a farmer's clothes, sitting in plain sight, drawing a map. But an eye, however sharp, is only half of a seeing thing. An eye is worthless if there is no nerve to carry what it sees back to the brain, and worse than worthless if the enemy can find the nerve and cut it. The nerve in this story was the strangest part of all, because it was not a wire the Japanese could ever locate. It was a whole country that had turned against them. When the Japanese conquered the Philippines in the first months of the war, they took the land, but they never took the people. Tens of thousands of American and Filipino soldiers had surrendered, but not all of them. Scattered across the mountains and the jungles were officers who had simply refused to give up. In the far north of Luzon, an American named Russell Volkman melted into the hill country, gathered the fragments of broken units around him, and over 2 years rebuilt them into an army of many thousands answering to a single command. In central Luzon, Robert Lapham did the same. Around Manila, Edwin Ramsey ran a network almost within sight of the enemy's headquarters. On the southern island of Mindanao, Wendell Fertig built something close to a shadow government. These men were not spies in the ordinary sense. They were the visible tips of something far larger and far harder to kill, which was the loyalty of the population itself. By the recognized count, there were 277 separate guerrilla organizations in the islands and 250,000 fighters formally acknowledged after the war. The real number of people who helped was almost certainly more than 1 million. And crucially, the resistance had informants everywhere the Japanese needed Filipinos to function. It had agents inside the puppet government the Japanese had installed. It had clerks and drivers and laborers on the enemy's own airfields and in the enemy's own offices. This was not a spy ring that could be rolled up by arresting a dozen people. This was the entire nervous system of a society, and every nerve ending was a pair of eyes. The genius, and the thing the Japanese never fully grasped, was that all of this was wired together. American submarines slipped through the blockade and came up at night off lonely beaches to deliver the one thing the guerrillas could not make for themselves: radios, and the parts and the trained operators to run them. Once a guerrilla network had a radio, it stopped being a local band of fighters and became a sensor plugged directly into MacArthur's headquarters hundreds of miles away. And the information those sensors sent was not vague. It was astonishing in its detail. In one region, guerrilla agents working as laborers on a Japanese airfield smuggled out copies of the airfield's own construction plans, drawn by one of their own men who had been hired as a surveyor. The reporting became so fine that headquarters could be told how many truckloads of gravel the Japanese needed to fill a single bomb crater and how many laborers it would take to finish the job. In that same net, a report of enemy aircraft taking off could reach Australia within 5 minutes of the planes leaving the ground. Think about what that means. The Japanese could not move a company down a road, could not repair a runway, could not shift a garrison, without a farmer or a clerk or a truck driver marking it and passing it on. The same net watched the sea. Along lonely stretches of coast, guerrilla coast watchers hidden in the tree line reported the movements of Japanese ships, turning whole shorelines into eyes for the American submarines and aircraft that hunted that shipping. Near Manila itself, the network run by Edwin Ramsey operated so close to the enemy's seat of power that from the hills his men could look down on the lights of the occupied capital. This was not a handful of daring individuals working alone. It was an island-spanning web of watchers, and the Japanese garrison lived its whole life inside that web without ever being able to draw a map of it. Now put the two halves together, because this is the machine our title is really asking about. Above and behind everything sat the high eyes and the code breakers. Woven through the whole country was the guerrilla net and its radios, and behind that the ordinary loyalty of millions of people. And at the sharp point, when a specific target had to be pinned down to the last sentry, went the Alamo scouts, to look at it with their own eyes and confirm what the network already suspected. One of the scout officers said it plainly after the war. On Luzon, he recalled, the guerrilla forces furnished the answers to nearly every question the army needed answered before it landed. The scouts often did not even have to go ashore ahead of an invasion, because the picture was already there, waiting, drawn by the people who lived on the ground. None of it came free. A network built out of human loyalty is paid for in human lives, and this one was paid for dearly. Radios were captured. Operators were caught. Early in the occupation, one of the first stations struggling to raise Australia was located and seized, and the men who had run it paid with their lives. When the Japanese took a guerrilla leader alive, they often executed not only him but the men around him, and when they suspected a village of feeding the resistance, the reprisals fell on everyone. A single betrayal could unravel months of work and end in a row of graves. The men who ran these nets learned caution the hard way, watching friends disappear into interrogation cells and not come out. The wonder is not that the network sometimes failed. The wonder is that under that kind of pressure it grew instead of shrinking. And it grew for a reason that the Japanese themselves supplied. 3 years of occupation had taught the population exactly what surrender to this enemy meant, and then, in December of 1944, that lesson was written in fire. On the island of Palawan, the Japanese had held about 150 American prisoners of war. As American forces drew closer, the guards, acting on the logic that prisoners must never be allowed to be liberated and talk, herded the men into air raid shelters and killed them. 139 died. Only 11 escaped, and they lived only because Filipino civilians hid them and guerrillas carried them to safety. And here the two threads of this story braid together in the grimmest possible way, because it was that same guerrilla network, the same invisible nerve, that carried the news of the massacre out of Palawan and up to MacArthur's headquarters. The men who mapped the guard posts also delivered the warning of what would happen to every prisoner still in Japanese hands if the Americans did not reach them first. The occupation had proven, beyond any argument, that neutrality was not survival. After Palawan, the choice was made permanent. The network did not just endure. It hardened into something the enemy could feel pressing in on him from every side and could never seem to grab. If a story like this, about the eyes that history forgot and the people who were those eyes, is one you think more viewers should see, the like button under this video is the smallest possible way to make that happen. So many of the men and women in this account were never named in any headline. A moment of your attention is a way of naming them now. Consider subscribing if you want the rest. By the start of 1945, the machine was complete. Brain, high eyes, ground eyes, and a nerve running through an entire population. And then the war handed that machine the hardest possible test. A test where the cost of a single wrong number would be counted in the lives of men too weak to run. The target was the prison camp near the town of Cabanatuan, in the province of Nueva Ecija, on Luzon. Inside its wire were more than 500 Allied prisoners, most of them Americans, and most of them survivors of the Bataan Death March, and nearly 3 years of starvation and disease. They were skeletons. Most had been taken prisoner in the fall of Bataan and Krueger at the very start of the war, had survived the murderous march that followed their capture, and had then spent nearly 3 years behind that wire on starvation rations, worn down by malaria and dysentery and despair. Many could barely walk, and the camp sat roughly 30 miles behind the Japanese front by the roads the raiders would have to travel, in a countryside crawling with enemy troops, with thousands of Japanese soldiers within a few hours of the wire. To reach it, a rescue force would have to cross the lines on foot, move undetected through enemy country, destroy the garrison, and then carry hundreds of men who could not walk back out the way it had come. And after Palawan, everyone in the planning knew the arithmetic. If the raid was late, or clumsy, or wrong about a single guard post, the prisoners would not be rescued, they would be killed. It was the most dangerous kind of test there is, because there was no such thing as an acceptable near miss. The men who would carry the rifles were the 6th Ranger Battalion, under Lieutenant Colonel Henry Mucci, with the assault led by Captain Robert Prince, but the Rangers were only the fist. The seeing had already been done. For months, the local guerrillas under Captain Juan Pajota and Captain Eduardo Joson, part of Major Robert Lapham's command, had watched that camp and the roads around it. They knew the ground, the enemy's habits, the timing of patrols. And now, to nail down the last and finest details, the Alamo scouts went in. 2 scout teams, led by First Lieutenant William Nellist and First Lieutenant Thomas Rounseville, moved up to the objective and put it under close watch. And then 2 of them did the thing that is the entire heart of this story. They dressed as local farmers, borrowed the clothes and the manner of the men who worked those fields, and set up an observation post in a small grass shack in the rice paddies within a few hundred yards of the Japanese guard posts. To reach it, they had moved by night through country thick with enemy patrols, guided the last stretch by local men who knew every dike and ditch by feel, so that by first light they were simply 2 more figures stooped over the seedlings, close enough to hear the guards speaking. They sat there, in plain view, and they catalogued the camp. They mapped the rectangle of it, roughly 600 by 800 yards, cut through the middle by the road. They counted the fences, 3 lines of barbed wire, 6 to 8 feet high. They marked the main gate and the single sentry in his sheltered post. They counted 3 guard towers, each about 12 feet tall, and located the pillbox with its 4 heavily armed guards. They identified the shed that held the enemy's tanks. They counted the men, roughly 70 Japanese on guard at the wire, and marked that another 150 or so had come into the compound to rest. And the sentries in those 12-foot towers, whose entire job was to watch that open ground, looked at the 2 farmers in the shack all day and never suspected a thing. When the Rangers arrived to launch, the scouts sent word that their picture was not yet complete, and that fresh enemy units were moving through the area. Mucci did something that only makes sense if you understand how much the whole operation rested on the seeing. He held the raid. He waited a full 24 hours, gambling the lives of everyone involved on the judgment of 2 lieutenants in a grass hut, because a raid launched into an incomplete picture was worse than no raid at all. That is the measure of the trust the system had earned. The men with the guns waited on the men with the pencils. By the time the assault went in, the camp had been solved before a shot was fired. Every ranger knew his lane. The plan folded in the local knowledge of the guerrillas, including one idea that came straight from Captain Pajota, who had noticed that the Japanese guards were fascinated and distracted whenever an aircraft passed overhead. So as the Rangers made their final crawl across the cleared ground, an American P-61 Black Widow night fighter appeared over the camp and put on a show, its engines coughing and roaring as it swooped and climbed, and every guard in every tower turned his face up to the sky to watch it, exactly as Pajota had predicted. While the enemy stared upward, the Rangers reached their firing positions on ground that had been pre-assigned to them from a map drawn in a shack. Meanwhile, Pajota's guerrillas had mined a bridge over the Kabu River and dug in to hold off the Japanese reinforcements everyone knew would come, and when those reinforcements came, the guerrillas held them for the length of time the prisoners needed, and not a minute less. Then the assault opened, and the camp that had held those men for years was overrun in less than half an hour. The hardest part was not the fighting, it was the rescue itself. Many of the prisoners, hearing gunfire and shouting in American voices, could not believe it was real, and some tried to hide from the men who had come to save them. They had to be carried. Filipino farmers had brought their carts and their water buffalo to haul out the ones who could not walk, and as the column formed up, the number of carts kept climbing, from a couple dozen to more than 100, as men who had started out on their own feet gave out along the way. In the darkness, a procession nearly a mile long shuffled back toward the American lines, sobbing and stumbling and free. 2 Rangers were killed. More than 500 prisoners came out, and General MacArthur, who had seen a great deal of the war, is widely quoted as saying that no single event of the entire Pacific campaign had given him more satisfaction than the return of those men. Now stand for a moment where the enemy stood, up in the tower, because that sentry is the man in our title. You watched the field all day. You did your duty. You saw a farmer in the paddy and a plane in the sky and nothing else, because there was nothing else your eyes were built to see. What you never saw was the map being drawn just across the open ground, or the bridge being mined, or the 100 carts gathering in the dark. When the shooting finally started, you already knew nothing, because every gun that was about to be aimed at you had been aimed hours before, on a piece of paper, by a man you had looked straight at and dismissed, and Cabanatuan was not a single stroke of luck. In those very same weeks, as the American army drove into Luzon, the same capability reached out and opened camp after camp. A fast-moving column pushed into Manila and freed the thousands of internees held at the university-turned-prison called Santo Tomas. Within a day, another force broke into the old walls of Bilibid prison and liberated the prisoners of war and civilians inside. Each of these rescues rode on the same foundation, the guerrilla networks that knew the ground and the safe routes, and the ordinary people who guided the fast-moving columns straight to the gates. This was not a trick that had worked once by chance. It was a machine, and a machine can be pointed at a new target and made to work again. So how did the Japanese explain it, when camp after camp was emptied this way, when their garrisons kept being struck by an enemy that seemed to know their business better than they did? They reached, as armies do, for the answer their experience already contained. They blamed betrayal. There must be spies. There must be traitors. There must be a specific leak, a specific informer, a specific enemy who could be found and caught and punished. And so the response, again and again, was to squeeze the population harder, to run counter-guerrilla sweeps, to seal off districts, to make examples of the villages they suspected. It was, in the coldest analytical sense, the wrong answer, and its wrongness is the whole point. Measure the size of the error. The thing that was defeating them was not a spy. It was structurally invisible to the way they thought. You can catch a spy, because a spy is a person with a name, but you cannot catch a whole country's decision about who it belongs to. The intelligence that mapped their guard posts did not live in one traitor's head. It was distributed across 1 million ordinary people, most of whom individually knew almost nothing, a sentry count here, a patrol time there, a truck movement noted in passing, all of it flowing together through the network into a single picture that no one of them could see whole. There was no headquarters to raid, because the headquarters was the population. Every reprisal, every execution of a suspected informer, every village punished, only confirmed to the survivors that the occupier was an enemy and pushed more eyes into the net. The harder the Japanese squeezed, the more transparent they became. They were trying to plug a leak in a thing that was made entirely of leaks by design. Some Japanese commanders were sharper than that, and understood at least the shape of the problem. They grasped that the guerrillas were the disease, and they mounted serious campaigns to hunt them. They swept whole districts. They herded populations into controlled zones for inspection, hunting for the fighters hidden among them. They tried to cut the resistance off from the sea of people that fed it. That was a correct diagnosis, as far as it went, and it still failed, because you cannot separate the fish from the water when the water itself has chosen the fish. Every sweep caught a few and turned 1,000 more into enemies for good, and the war handed them a chance to prove whether they had truly learned the lesson, because there was a second great prison camp still to be reached, and this time the enemy would not have the advantage of surprise in his favor. The camp was at Los Banos, south of Manila, and inside it were more than 2,100 civilian internees, men, women, and children, held by the Japanese, and by early 1945, slowly being starved. By now the conditions that had made Cabanatuan possible were gone. The Japanese were alert to the pattern of American rescue raids. The countryside around Los Banos held a large and dangerous concentration of enemy troops, thousands of them, close enough to overwhelm any small raiding force that lingered. The camp's own administration had grown crueler and more watchful as the war turned against them. Every factor that had favored the raiders at Cabanatuan had been reversed. If the network's ability to see was luck, or a one-time trick, this was where it would fail. It did not fail, because the network delivered once again the single decisive fact that no photograph and no code break could ever have provided. An internee named Peter Miles, a civilian engineer, slipped out of the camp and reached the American planners, and he brought with him a map of the enemy's positions and defenses, and something more valuable still, the daily rhythm of the guards. Every morning, at 7 o'clock, the great majority of the Japanese garrison assembled for physical exercise, calisthenics, in the open, in nothing but their loincloths, with their rifles locked away. For a few minutes each day, the men guarding 2,000 prisoners were nearly unarmed and out of position. Filipino guerrillas confirmed it. That was the window, and the entire raid was built to fall through it. What came through that window was a masterpiece of timing that depended, from first to last, on the accuracy of the seeing. In the pre-dawn dark, a reconnaissance platoon and their Filipino guerrilla guides crept into position around the camp's perimeter. Across the wide lake of Laguna de Bay, more than 50 amphibious tractors churned toward the shore carrying the main body of troops. And at exactly 7 o'clock in the morning on February 23, 1945, as the guards stood in the open doing their exercises, transport planes appeared overhead and the sky filled with the parachutes of the men of the 511th Parachute Infantry Regiment dropping directly onto the camp. In the same instant, the recon platoon and the guerrillas opened up on the guard posts. The garrison, caught precisely as Peter Miles had said it would be, unarmed and scattered, never recovered. Guards who ran for the jungle, met Filipino guerrillas waiting in the tree line. In a matter of minutes, the camp was taken, and then the long, careful work of loading the internees, whole families among them, the sick and the elderly and the children, into the amphibious tractors and carrying them back across the lake to safety began. Every internee came out. Not one of them was killed in the assault. 2 American soldiers died. An entire camp, deep in enemy territory, under the noses of thousands of Japanese troops, was emptied of its prisoners and vanished, and the great enemy force nearby was left grasping at empty air. Even alert, even concentrated, even braced for exactly this kind of attack, the enemy was still transparent. And that is the deepest cut of the whole story, the thing that should have told the Japanese what they were truly fighting, because the paratrooper drifting down into the camp was only the visible tip of it, the same way the farmer in the paddy had been, blind the enemy to one layer, and the next layer still saw. Beneath the paratroopers was the escaped prisoner and his map. Beneath the map was the guerrilla net that confirmed it. Beneath the net was a whole population that had never stopped watching, and behind all of it the radios and the submarines and the codebreakers. There was no single eye to put out. There were too many, and they belonged to everyone. There is a hard irony buried at the bottom of this. The Japanese had conquered the Philippines, but conquest of the ground is not conquest of the people, and an occupier who has failed to win the people is blind inside the very territory he thinks he controls. Every farmer he passed on the road was a potential censor. Every clerk in his own offices was a potential informant. He had taken the country and never noticed that the country had not surrendered its eyes. That is a lesson that outlived the war by a very long way. Before we close the case, a request that is really the whole reason this channel exists. If your father, your grandfather, or your uncle served in the Pacific, if he was a ranger or an Alamo scout or a paratrooper of the airborne, if he flew the transports or drove the amphibious tractors, or if your family were among the Filipino guerrillas who watched and counted and carried, or among the prisoners who walked out of those camps, I would be honored to read their story below. What was their unit? What did they tell you, or refuse to tell you? Those details outlive the archives, and they disappear the moment we stop asking for them. So let us close the case, and let us do it with the one image that holds the whole thing in miniature. Think about how the two sides built their seeing. The Japanese built theirs upward. They put their eyes on platforms 12 feet in the air, elevated, armored, with a clear field of fire across cleared ground, designed to spot any enemy the instant he approached. It was a good design, for the enemy they expected. The Americans and the Filipinos built their seeing the opposite way. They put their eyes at ground level and lower, inside a peasant's hut, inside a fishing boat, inside the population itself, woven so deeply into the ordinary life of the country that it could not be told apart from it. On the morning of the raid, the towers looked out across their empty field and saw nothing worth reporting. The hut had already seen everything. Japan built better watchtowers. The Allies built a better way of seeing. One of them was looking for the enemy. The other was already living inside the enemy's own country. That is what the scouts really were. They did not read minds and they did not work magic. The knowledge existed before any scout arrived, spread out in fragments across thousands of ordinary lives, and the scout's job was only to gather up the last few yards of it and carry it safely home. To the man in the watchtower, that is indistinguishable from sorcery, because he cannot see the thing that produced it. A network you cannot imagine looks exactly like witchcraft, and a people you have failed to conquer, working silently against you in their own land, looks exactly like fate. That is why the feeling in the story is bafflement, and not simple envy. A Japanese garrison commander carried in his head a complete working model of what occupation meant. Hold the ground, control the roads, guard the wire, punish the spies, do those things, and the territory is yours. He had run that model for 3 years, and inside it there was no category, none at all, for a whole population functioning as a single instrument of intelligence. When the model broke, when raid after raid arrived already knowing his secrets, he went looking for the cause among the things his model could contain. A spy, a traitor, a leak, something with a face he could put against a wall. He never found the real cause, because the real cause had no single face. It had 1,000,000 of them, and they were the faces he passed on the road every day. Run the final audit plainly, and let the numbers stand on their own. The Alamo scouts carried out more than 100 missions behind enemy lines and never lost a man to death or capture on an operation, a record unmatched in the history of the American Army. Fewer than 140 men earned the name. At Cabanatuan, more than 500 prisoners were carried out of a camp deep inside enemy territory at a cost of 2 rangers killed. At Los Banos, more than 2,000 internees were rescued from under the guns of a far larger enemy force, and not one prisoner died in the assault. Behind those raids stood 277 recognized guerrilla organizations and 250,000 acknowledged fighters, and behind them a whole nation of people who were never counted at all. Against every bit of it, the Japanese fielded a counterintelligence effort that could catch a spy and could never, ever catch the country. An army can occupy a place. It cannot occupy a people. And an occupier the people have refused is blind on his own ground, no matter how many towers he builds. The men and women who made the seeing possible mostly went home and vanished into ordinary life, the way that generation did. The Alamo Scouts were disbanded without ceremony in Japan in November of 1945 and never brought back, and it was not until 1988 that the Army formally recognized them as forefathers of its modern special forces. The youngest of the Scouts at Cabanatuan, a soft-spoken young soldier named Galen Kittleson, would go on decades later to help lead another raid to rescue prisoners, in another war, in Vietnam, carrying the same craft into a new generation. Henry Mucci and Robert Prince received the Distinguished Service Cross and then went back to civilian lives, one of them into ordinary business, as if they had not just pulled off one of the great rescues of the war. Peter Miles, the engineer, walked out of a prison camp with a map in his head and handed an entire camp of prisoners their lives. And the Filipino guerrillas, the Pahotas and the Josons, and the tens of thousands of farmers and clerks and drivers who were the actual eyes of the whole enterprise, went back to their fields and their towns, and most of their names were never written down anywhere, and their proper recognition was delayed for decades. They watched an empire, and it never saw them at all. Every modern idea about this kind of warfare traces back to what happened in those islands. The notion that the decisive intelligence in a war among the people is not a machine but a relationship, that reconnaissance embedded in a population beats fortification built against it, that the eyes which matter most are often the ones the enemy has already looked at and dismissed. The Scouts and the guerrillas proved it 3/4 of a century ago, and armies are still relearning it today. The lesson was never really about the Pacific. It was about what an army can and cannot see, and about the difference between holding a country and being welcome in it. Subscribe if you want the next audit, and if this one gave you something to think about, the like button helps it reach the people who care about getting the history right rather than the version that fits neatly on a poster. But before you go, remember what the story actually proves, and remember the ones who proved it. Walter Krueger, who insisted his army grow its own eyes. William Nellist and Thomas Rounserville, who sat in a grass hut in a farmer's clothes and drew the enemy's camp while its own sentries watched the empty field. Henry Mucci and Robert Prince, who trusted the men with the pencils. Juan Pajota and Eduardo Joson, who held the bridge and knew the ground. John Ringler and George Scow and the paratroopers who fell out of the 7 o'clock sky. Peter Miles, who remembered the one fact that mattered. Galen Kittleson, who carried it forward, and the uncounted thousands who watched and counted and carried and were never named. To the sentry in the tower, they were invisible. Let them not be invisible to us.